Wi-Fi motherboard. I'm also using a range of GPUs for this testing, which we'll go through in some of the charts. For reflex testing, I'm using NVIDIA's LDAT, or Latency Display Analysis tool, which is essentially a photo detector that you can place on the screen to measure game latency. This is a better version of the tools we were already using for latency measurements, which were also based on a photo detector, and we've confirmed it to be very accurate. Later, I'll be exploring the Reflex Latency Analyzer, but for now, we're measuring total system latency from mouse click to action on screen using LDAT. I wanted to start off by looking at how Reflex improves latency when we are gaming with the maximum in-game quality settings. This is where NVIDIA says we should see the most benefit. The more GPU bound you are, the more likely Reflex will deliver a latency improvement. So here first up, we are testing in Fortnite's creative mode using DirectX 12, the Epic preset, and maximum ray tracing. I'm also using the DLSS performance mode and an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3090 Founders Edition GPU, with the display being a 4K 144Hz panel with adaptive sync enabled, the LG 27GN950 in this instance. At 4K, we saw the most benefit from using Reflex, and in fact the gains here are quite impressive. Total system latency was around 104 milliseconds with Reflex disabled, but when turning on the feature, we saw latency halved to under 50 milliseconds. There wasn't much difference between Reflex On and Reflex On plus Boost, which keeps the GPU clocked up high to further improve latency, but with either Reflex mode, we saw quite a significant latency improvement here. In contrast, NVIDIA's ultra-low latency mode doesn't improve the experience, as null doesn't work with DirectX 11 titles. At 1440p, gains were still present, but not as significant as at 4K. While at 4K we were gaming around 45 FPS, reducing the resolution to 1440p saw us jump up to 85 FPS. We are no longer seeing half the latency with Reflex enabled, but a 12 millisecond reduction is still decent and something that I could notice while gaming. This is all with G-Sync enabled and V-Sync disabled, so we're getting the optimal V-Sync related latency. There are also gains to be had here at 1080p, with about a 10 millisecond improvement in my testing. Given the RTX 3090 is quite powerful, still being able to achieve better latency at 1080p with Reflex enabled is decent. But the largest gains and the most notable improvement in responsiveness was observed when the GPU was bound at below 60 FPS. However, you aren't always going to be GPU bound. The RTX 3090 makes easy work of Valorant, for example, running at over 600 FPS in our test area at all resolutions with the Core i9-10900K. It's here that, even when playing on the maximum quality settings, that Reflex delivers next to no improvement. With latency around the 16 millisecond mark in all situations, which is very, very responsive, there isn't much else Reflex can do in terms of optimization. I also saw less of a gain when playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare's Warzone mode. Even when playing at 4K, using the highest settings with ray tracing enabled, Reflex only provided about a 3 millisecond reduction to input latency with all of the resolutions I tested. There was a consistent gain, but with this sort of GPU power at hand, the improvement wasn't in the same league as with Fortnite. While you do clearly need to be GPU bound to see large improvements with Reflex, and that isn't as possible with the RTX 3090, if you have an entry-level GPU like the GeForce GTX 1650 Super, you are much more likely to get a latency improvement using the Reflex mode. In Fortnite, with the Epic preset used but without ray tracing as the 1650 Super doesn't support it, Reflex provided a similar benefit to what we saw with the 3090 at 4K, but this time at 1440p and 1080p. In both of these modes, the game is pretty GPU bound and runs below 100 FPS on our test island. Here we see Reflex halving the input latency, which makes quite a significant difference to gameplay on these systems where you are still wanting all the visual effects being cranked right up. We also saw a latency improvement in Valorant using Reflex on this class of GPU. We're no longer seeing over 600 FPS, in fact at 4K the 1650 Super is more like an 80 FPS GPU using the highest quality settings. In this situation, we saw a healthy 19 millisecond latency improvement, which isn't quite a halving of total system latency, but still a very significant jump in this sort of title. Gains were more modest at 1440p with just a 9 millisecond drop to latency, and at 1080p with just a 6 millisecond drop. But still, in these conditions, it doesn't appear the game is fully GPU bound, so we don't see a situation like with the 3090 where Reflex is useless. Call of Duty Warzone consistently delivered us the least impressive latency improvements. Even with the GTX 1650 Super, which runs at below 60 FPS at 1080p with high quality settings, we only saw about a 10 to 12 millisecond improvement to system latency when enabling the feature, and this was at both 1440p and 1080p. To me, this was pretty hard to notice, especially with the frame rate around 50 FPS, which isn't the most responsive, but for more highly tuned competitive gamers, this might be a significant difference. In general though, our testing shows that when you are playing on high to ultra quality settings, and you're mostly GPU bound, Reflex will provide a latency improvement, especially in titles like Fortnite. The gains are going to be more pronounced on lower end cards as your system in general will be more GPU limited, and that seems to be key for Reflex. The more your CPU is sitting idle, the more potential there is for a latency improvement. I would expect that on systems with a weaker CPU, like say a Ryzen 5 1600, you'd get the reverse effect and there would be less of a gain in some situations. With this in mind, I wanted to test Reflex with competitive esports settings. Most of the time, if you are a serious competitive gamer, you'll be playing using mostly low settings. This allows you to achieve a higher frame rate, which inherently lowers total latency, but it can also often make spotting enemies easier without the distractions of shadows and other effects. So if you've already done a lot of things to optimize your system for latency, you're getting very high frame rates and you're playing at 1080p, what can Reflex do for you? Well, the answer to that is practically nothing. I'm not even using a super high-end GPU for this testing to emphasize the point. This is a system with a Core i9-10900K to give us the least amount of CPU bottlenecking, but just an RTX 2060 GPU. I've hooked it up to my ASUS ROG Swift PG259QNR as well to get that sweet 360Hz goodness with adaptive sync. In Fortnite, using the lowest settings, no ray tracing, the DLSS performance mode and epic draw distance, I was able to achieve around 400 FPS in my test area. At this sort of super high frame rate, latency was already very low without Reflex, at just 14 milliseconds of total system latency. Reflex did not improve this result whatsoever, as we are fully CPU bound. Same story in Valorant. I was achieving between 600 and 1000 FPS using the game's lowest settings, and latency was consistently around the 13 millisecond mark whether Reflex was enabled or disabled. The boost mode hasn't done much so far, even though it's supposed to help a bit with latency in more CPU bound situations. And then we also have Warzone here, where there was a small latency improvement of around 4 milliseconds when using Reflex in combination with the lower settings. However, in this title with the lower settings, I did appear to be GPU bound rather than CPU bound, so I'd expect results to fall more in line with the other titles if I tested with a higher end GPU, like an RTX 3090, using the lowest possible settings. What's also important to note here is that the gains you see from Reflex are independent of your monitor's refresh rate when gaming with VSync disabled, as you should be for the lowest latency possible. For example, in Fortnite with a 1080p display, Reflex consistently gave us a 9 millisecond improvement in our testing across the board with the RTX 2060 using epic settings, at the same frame rate, regardless if the monitor was set to 360Hz or 60Hz. The main difference is that you'll see additional latency added at lower refresh rates, so it's always better to be gaming at the highest possible refresh rate. So a lot of these latency results fall in line with what we've seen previously from latency reduction modes. When GPU bound, especially when heavily GPU bound, there is often scope to reduce system latency. The extent of the reduction will depend on the game and how it works. But when CPU bound, your system is basically flat out, and you won't see much, if any, of a latency improvement. The closer to being CPU bound you are, which generally correlates with higher frame rates, the less useful Reflex is. Before giving our final thoughts on NVIDIA's Reflex, it's also worth going through and looking at the tools NVIDIA are providing through their Reflex Latency Analyzer. While the LDAT tool we used for our Reflex analysis isn't available to our end users or buyers, every aspect of the Reflex Latency Analyzer will be available, although some elements do have a cost. So let's first talk about the tools that are available to you without any specific latency hardware. In some Reflex-enabled games like Fortnite and Valorant, you can enable a latency overlay in the game which shows various metrics. In both cases, we end up seeing what's known as game-to-render latency, in other words, the time it takes from when the game receives an input to when the frame is output to the display. This is not total system latency, which also includes the latencies from your display and input peripherals, but for a lot of people, this game-to-render latency will also be a good enough metric for optimizing latency. You can also use GeForce Experience's new latency performance overlay, however this only shows GPU side latencies such as render latency, not the full game to render latency, so its usefulness without additional Reflex Latency Analyzer hardware is limited. In games like Fortnite though, you can use the built-in tool, mess around with your settings and see how that impacts the total latency number presented. For more hardcore latency enthusiasts, NVIDIA are offering a hardware ecosystem in conjunction with various partners that allows for further, more in-depth latency analysis. This comes in the form of two components. the reflex latency analyzer built into some displays, and reflex latency analyzer compatible mice. I could spend a ton of time detailing how all of this stuff works, but to be honest, that wouldn't be that interesting. It would probably take a while. So if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, you can read NVIDIA's documentation on it. But it basically boils down to this. When you have both a reflex latency analyzer equipped monitor like the ASUS ROG Swift PG259QNR and a reflex latency analyzer compatible mouse like the ASUS ROG Chakram Core, you can measure total system latency. So this includes not just the game to render latency that titles like Fortnite can report, but mouse latency and display latency as well. This gives us the most valuable and accurate latency information possible. It takes a bit of time to set up and it's really only suitable for benchmark conditions. It won't give you good results in general gameplay as you have to position the capture area for the latency analyzer over a muzzle flash, for example, and that could change in dynamic gameplay. But with this hardware in conjunction with the GeForce Experience latency overlay, you can benchmark total system latency and optimize your configuration around that metric. Generally speaking, I found the reflex latency analyzer to be within 1 millisecond of LDAT, so it's a pretty accurate tool, although it pulls data from the G-Sync module's frame buffer as opposed to getting a readout directly from the display's pixels. So in that sense, LDAT is the more complete tool. But for most people, the reflex latency analyzer will be plenty accurate enough and certainly much more accurate than any other tool currently available that's this easy to use. The PG259QNR is also just a reflex latency analyzer version of the PG259QN that we already reviewed, so by itself it's an excellent 1080p 360Hz display in the times that you won't be using this feature. I believe there are other monitors coming that support the tool from Acer and Alienware as well, so of course it's always worth shopping around. Overall, NVIDIA's reflex ecosystem is kind of a tale of two separate but related entities. On the one hand, you have the reflex mode integrated into games, and on the other hand, you have the reflex latency analyzer. Despite being related, they're almost designed for two different groups of people with little crossover, so I'll explain what I mean. The reflex mode you'll find in games, as seen throughout our testing, is most useful in GPU limited situations. In these competitive titles, most of the time you'll be GPU limited when you're either playing on, say, ultra quality settings, using a lower end GPU, or some combination of both. The more CPU limited your system becomes, the higher the frame rate pushes, the less useful reflex is for enhancing system latency. This makes reflex a useful feature primarily for casual multiplayer gamers. The people that want to play Fortnite but don't want to sacrifice visual quality, don't necessarily want to play at 1080p, or just don't have the most powerful hardware. Turn on reflex, your system latency will drop, and that improvement to responsiveness might make you a bit better at the game when facing your mates or randoms online. On the flip side, reflex is next to useless for serious competitive gamers. If you're the sort of person that already has a latency optimized setup, so you're already playing at 1080p on powerful hardware with low settings to ensure you're getting the highest possible frame rate, then reflex will have no benefit whatsoever. That's because you're almost certainly CPU limited, and reflex is ineffective in those situations. This holds true even in situations with mid-range GPUs like an RTX 2060 in titles like Fortnite and Valorant when gaming with low quality settings. There's no downside to having reflex enabled in those situations, but don't expect to see even lower latencies than you're already getting in a fully optimized environment. This is really for the casual gamers that don't want to sacrifice, say, ray tracing or 4K resolutions while gaming competitively, but still want a nice and responsive experience, and that's fine. The reflex latency analyzer, though, is really for the serious competitive gamers that want to do everything possible to reduce system latency, so kind of the opposite to the reflex game mode. Having the tools available to do that are neat and potentially useful for tweaking hardware setups and game configurations, but realistically this isn't something a casual gamer will be doing, especially because buying a monitor with this feature integrated isn't going to be cheap. The PG259QN is already a $700 monitor without the latency analyzer integrated, and there are plenty of gamers that would rather spend that cash on, say, a 1440p or 4K display, not something 1080p. I can see the reflex feature in games being widely used, but the reflex latency analyzer and compatible mice seems like a really niche feature that probably won't get much traction outside a very small user base. With that in mind, I do have question marks over how long NVIDIA will support something like this, which may in turn throw up question marks over whether it's worth investing in latency analyzer hardware. It's certainly neat and it works well, but without that broad user base, I can see it getting the chop after just a few years, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. The other question I'm sure some of you will be asking is Is it worth buying an NVIDIA GPU over the competition specifically for reflex? After all, this is being pushed heavily as the next best thing, similar to how NVIDIA was positioning DLSS and ray tracing with Turing GPUs. Well, I guess part of the good news is if you're already in the NVIDIA ecosystem, Reflex works with 900 series GPUs and newer, so don't go out and feel that you have to upgrade to Ampere to get Reflex. You don't, although this isn't made super clear on the Reflex page on the NVIDIA website, which is a bit frustrating. Outside of that, at this stage, I don't think it's worth considering Reflex into your buying decisions all that much. This isn't a DLSS 1.0 situation where the feature is total garbage and not worth using. It does work properly and can give you a latency improvement, but Reflex is restricted to a very small handful of settings right now. You have to be playing one of the few supported titles, and then on top of that be playing in a GPU limited situation to see the benefit. And not all games benefit in the same way, with some titles giving large gains and others more negligible gains. If the only thing you do is you play Fortnite or Valorant or Apex Legends, then yeah, buying an NVIDIA GPU might be the way to go. But if you're one of the many gamers that plays a variety of titles, or other competitive games for that matter that aren't supported right now, then like DLSS or ray tracing, I think it's better to view this as a neat bonus feature for now. If the Reflex ecosystem continues to grow and Reflex becomes a key feature in most competitive titles, then maybe that will change. But for now, that ecosystem is just too small for it to be a must-have feature. Well, I don't think it's a must-have feature right now. I don't want to take anything away from what NVIDIA has achieved here, because Reflex is an impressive feature. It's definitely worth using in supported titles, and I would put this in the class of features like DLSS 2.0, where if a game has it and it's supported and it works well, then yeah, turn it on and use it. I mean, we recommend you use DLSS 2.0 in games that support it, and I would certainly recommend using Reflex in games that support that feature as well. It just is going to have to expand in terms of the ecosystem before it becomes that feature that you might swing one way or another in terms of your GPU purchasing for two otherwise very similar GPUs. So, but yeah, at least in those games where it's supported right now, like your Fortnites and Apex Legends and Valorant, is definitely a feature that I would recommend people use. And yeah, it's a nice little bonus to have if you do have any of those 900 series NVIDIA GPUs or newer. And it is going to be a thing that, you know, AMD is going to have to come in and compete with in the future to be as competitive as NVIDIA from a feature perspective. So anyway, that's really it for this analysis of NVIDIA's Reflex ecosystem. It's always interesting to get back in and check out latencies in games and that sort of thing. It's not something we do super often and probably won't be doing it in the future either until new features come out. But if you are interested in our latency testing and all that sort of thing, let us know in the comments below, because we always appreciate hearing from you guys. We also have our Our Patreon page. Yeah, sign up to that if you appreciate our testing and want to support the channel directly. You get access to things like Discord chat, monthly live streams, all that sort of thing. Subscribe for more testing, and I'll catch you in the next one.